So today I got something a little bit different for you guys. I know we are working on a series right now, but I wanted to take some time to do some additional features for the Coders Tape website. Now, the very quick recap on this, if you're not familiar, I have this website, coderstape.com, and what it does is basically it has the same exact videos that we have in YouTube, with the difference that there's some additional features. If you register, it is free. Let me go ahead and log in. Now you can mark lessons as completed. For example, let's go to this first lesson here, and we can simply mark this as completed. And so if you go back to this series, now that one will have a little check mark and say completed. Additionally, you could take some notes here about the video. And I figured this section here would sort of be your own sections and notes on this particular video. And if we refresh, of course, those notes are saved. What I wanted to show you guys is I wanted to add some new features to this site, and I figured it'd make a great video to show you guys sort of a behind the scenes of this actual app in production. I want to start off easy, but today what I want to handle is I want to add a new link here for all new lessons. So think about this. If you've been watching Coders Tape lessons and you've been marking them as completed, say in the example of our 5.8 tutorial, there's quite a bit of videos in there. But if you've already marked a lot of them as completed, perhaps what I want to do is just have a view of all of the lessons you have not watched. So we're going to call those new lessons, and it's just going to be a cool real world thing that I'm going to implement. Now again, if you're not registered with our website, it's free. If you'd like to use it, you're more than welcome to. The website just gives you a little bit more of a classroom setting where you're actually taking notes instead of just browsing through YouTube and hoping that the next lesson kind of comes up. That's another nice feature here. I did not show you that. But if you are logged in, let me go ahead and log in again, and let's go back here to this tutorial. You do have this next button down here. So if you hit next, it goes, of course, to lesson 2. You could hit next again, and we'll go to lesson 3. You can go to previous, and of course, we'll go to lesson 2, and so on and so forth. And you do read all the descriptions here and everything like that. So I think it's a great start, and it is a great companion for all of our lessons. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the source code for this site. Let's go to iTerm. And of course, let's start this with a test. Let's see, PHP Artisan, make a test for new lessons test. All right, let's go into PHP Storm, and let's go ahead and pull up that new lessons test. And there we go. All right, let's go ahead and get rid of this default test here, and let's start with a new test. So the first thing that I want to test is, obviously, you cannot find out what lessons are new if you are not logged in. So being logged in is a requirement. Now, we don't have a controller, we don't have a route, we don't really have anything just yet, but we could definitely make this work through TDD. So let's say only authenticated users can access new lessons. So let's do this. Let's try to fetch that /new lessons, and let's see what happens. Well, what do you expect this to be? Well, if we save the response, then we can assert that we actually got redirected. So let's say response, assert, redirect, and we redirect to /login. That's what would happen if we are not signed in. All right, let's go ahead and run this first test and see what we get. PHP unit -- filter, and then our test name. So obviously we get a 404, meaning nothing was found. But this, you know, is not the correct error. The error we have is the fact that this is not a real address just yet. So let's go ahead and run this without exception handling. Very quickly, exception handling is just the way that Laravel handles any exceptions that occur in our application. What it does is it turns exceptions into correct HTTP responses. In the case of this 404, it would make sense that if there is a route that you're requesting that does not have a proper route, then it's simply a 404. It was not found. But the internal error is what we really want. And this is the actual exception. The exception is the not found HTTP exception. So when Laravel handles the exception, what it does is it turns this not found HTTP exception into a 404, which is obviously a proper HTTP response status code. Okay, so the get route of /new lessons doesn't exist. All right, let's create that now. Back to PHP store. Let's go to web.php and let's add a new route. It's going to be a get route for /new-lessons. And we're going to go to a new lessons controller. Where should that hit? Well, that's going to hit an index, right? Remember that an index just shows us a list of a resource. So obviously these new lessons, we're going to treat them as a resource, and the index is the appropriate method for that. Let's go ahead and run the test again. And this time we're probably going to get something about the controller not existing. So we'll copy that. We'll say PHP artisan make a controller. And here's the name for it. Let's run our test again. And this time we get index does not exist. We know that. We just created the controller, but of course we didn't add anything to it. So let's open up the new lessons controller. And let's add a new method. Public function index. All right. And now finally we get to the error part. So we're getting a 200, which is just a proper response. But we're really supposed to be getting a redirection. So how do we make sure that somebody is logged in? Remember, in any controller, you can add a constructor and just say this middleware auth. That will force the auth middleware, which will redirect us unless you are logged in. Let's check that out. And now we get unauthenticated. So now we are getting the proper response, but this exception, in order for us to actually get the redirection, then we need Laravel to go ahead and actually handle the exception. So we need to turn this back on so that Laravel can do its thing. And sure enough, we get green when we run it like that. Now, one quick little side note on that. If you don't like putting it in your controller, I'm going to go ahead and comment that out. I'm going to run my test again, and of course, we're going to fail. Another approach is in your route file, you can actually say arrow middleware, and then in here say auth. And sure enough, you see that our test is back to green. That is exactly the same thing. The argument sometimes that comes up when you put it in your routes is that it's a lot easier to see the overall picture of middleware when it's in your route, because basically you don't have to open each controller to find out if any middleware is being applied to that route. I'm not a huge fan of it. I do like having it in my controller. So this is just the way that I default to it. But again, it may be something that you may want to consider to put in your routes. That's entirely up to you. But we are green. So let's move on to the next test. So let's add a new test here. In this next test, I want to test that the view has the correct data. Obviously, we're going to have to go into our database, grab the correct lessons, and the correct lessons are only lessons that have not been marked as watched. And we need our view to have that data. So let's say only uncompleted lessons are passed to the view. Okay, so let's go ahead and do something. First and foremost, as we proved with this very first test, we need to be logged in. So Laravel, in their testing helpers, we have this acting as. And to acting as, you have to pass in a user. Now the nice thing is, of course, we can use our factory and just whip up a user right on the fly. So we could say app user and then just call the create method on it. If you want to clean this up, of course, you can import this class as I did here. So now the class is up here, and that does clean it up a little bit because now you just see user. In order to do that, you need to have this up there. Well, what's the next step? We need a lesson, right? We don't even have a lesson. Remember, after every test, we are getting a blank database. So let's go ahead and use refresh database as a trait. And there it is. It's this one that's up here. We can actually get rid of that altogether, clean it up. And now let's go ahead and create a lesson. So let's create lesson number 1. You know what? Let's actually call it completed lesson. First of all, let's call on our factory. And I do have a lesson factory. Let me show you that now very quickly. So this is my lesson factory. So I can very quickly create a lesson. So let's say lesson class. And let's go ahead and create one lesson. Now lesson is being imported up here at the top, and there it is. And so how do we complete a lesson? Well, I actually have a test just for that I wrote in the current implementation. So let's go to the features test, and I have this lesson interactions test. And if we look through here, I have this test that says a video can be marked as completed. And it looks like all I need to do is hit a post to this route with the video ID, and the video ID being simply just the lesson ID. And if I do that, then that lesson gets marked as completed. So I can actually reuse that. So let's do a post request to /complete/ the video ID. And again, the video ID is really just a completed lesson ID. It's just the ID of the lesson that we are trying to complete. However, if we just create one lesson and we complete it, then we're not going to have any new lessons. Of course, we want to be able to have new lessons. So let's create another one and call this one uncompleted lesson. And again, we'll call to our factory and say, give me a new lesson. And let's create that. Okay, so we have a completed lesson and we have an uncompleted lesson. So what do we expect at this point? Well, let's actually make the request. So let's say response equals this get. What are we going to get? Well, we're going to get /new-lessons. And now what can we assert on this response? Well, you can actually say response like so, right? And do something like assert OK, for example. Or you can actually chain these together like so. And I do like this flow a little bit better. So we're going to assert that it's OK. Let's go ahead and start running our test. It's not ready yet, but let's go ahead and start running it so we can start getting some feedback. So far, so good. Everything is good. Our code is good. Syntax is good. So what else can we assert? So yes, we are hitting this endpoint. But now here's the thing. We need the data that the view is receiving. So let's do something. Let's do response original. And the original is simply just the original request, not the response, the actual request. And that's what original gives us. And there's a method in here called getData. So if I save this to maybe view data, what can we assert? How about this? Assert count. First thing I want to do is I want to assert that there's only one lesson. So even though I created two lessons, only one of them should show up. So let's assert count 1 of view data, and view data is actually an array. So we can just request the key that we're looking for. I'm going to call that uncompleted lessons in my view. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to assert a count of 1 on that one. And finally, maybe just compare IDs. I want the ID of the one uncompleted lesson to be matched up to this uncompleted lesson right here. So let's say this assert equals uncompleted lesson ID. That should be the same as view data, and then give me uncompleted lessons. And of that one, that's actually going to be a collection. So I just need the first one. So we'll grab the first one and then grab its ID. Now to clean this up a little bit, if we moved this over to in here, then we can actually get rid of it in each of these calls. And I think that gets cleaned up a little bit. All right, so we are good to go on this test. Let's go ahead and give it a run and see what kind of errors we get. So right off the bat, we're getting a member to a function of getData unnull. So that means that our view is null. So we need to return a view. Let's go ahead and do that here. Let's return a new view. Now I have this convention where I name my controllers and views the same way. So this is my new lessons controller. So I'm going to call the directory new-lessons. And then this is the index method. So I'm going to put an index.blade.php file inside of there. And let's go ahead and create a new directory. And it's going to be new-lessons. And inside here, let's create a new file, which is going to be index.blade.php. And yes, I do want to add that. All right, so inside this index.blade extends layouts.app. That's just my layout. And let's go ahead and start a new section for the content and section. All right, let's run our test. All right, so undefined index of uncompleted lessons. Of course, we are not passing any data in the controller, so of course that's not going to work. So let's go ahead and for now, let me do uncompleted lessons. I'm just going to set that equal to an empty array. Obviously that's going to fail, but let's go ahead and pass that through to the view. So uncompleted lessons. Run the test. And now we get that we are asserting that an actual size of 0 matches the size of 1. So in true TDD fashion, really, I could literally just put anything in here, and that would actually change our error, which it does. But now we're calling first on an array. We really do know what's going on here. So let's just go ahead and start to implement what we really need. So here's what I'm thinking. Every authenticated user has a relationship, and that relationship is in a belongs to many of completed lessons. Let me show you that. Let me go to my user.php file, my model. We have this completed relationship. So I can fetch all of the completed relationships and grab their IDs. And then I could do a database query to go ahead and grab any lessons that are not in that list of IDs. Let's see what that would look like. Let's say completed lessons, not uncompleted, but completed lessons, right? That's what our user is going to give us. So let's just say auth user, meaning give me the authenticated user, give me their completed, and then pluck just their ID. All right, let's see what we get there. Completed lessons. Let me die and dump that and show you what that looks like. Just simply looks like a collection with an array, and it has ID of 1. Obviously, we created one completed lesson, so that's why that ID is 1. Armed with that information, we could say lesson, that is app lesson. Notice how it got imported up here. So lesson where not in. Where not in accepts two parameters. The first one is the column that we're going to be comparing to. So let's say ID, and as a second parameter, it accepts an array. So let's go ahead and give it completed lessons. So what we're saying here is fetch me everything that is not in the completed lessons when you compare it to the ID column. And go ahead and fetch me all of those records. So let's go ahead and die and dump uncompleted lessons this time. And let's check out what we got. And sure enough, we have ID 2 and nothing else. So we just have the single lesson, which is what we've been looking for. Okay, let's run our test and see what we get. And we are green. Awesome. Let's run the entire test, not just the one test. And yes, we are still green. Okay, so our back end is set up. Let's switch over now and start talking about our front end. So of course, our front end is going to have this new uncompleted lessons variable. So what I'm thinking is just having rows for each of the lessons. So let's say for each uncompleted lessons as maybe just lesson to keep it nice and short. And for each, so for each one, let's add a new row. And the first thing I want is maybe let's do a column of 3. And inside of there, I want the image of each of the lessons. Now, I do have this nice little helper that I put together in my lessons model. Let me show you that now. So in my lessons, if we scroll up, we have this image. And what the image does is it basically just grabs the YouTube thumbnail. Now, I do nice thumbnails for each of the videos, and this is one of the reasons why, because I want to just be able to use that. So I can just call this image method on each of those lessons and get an image. So let's say source, and then let's use the lesson image for that lesson. So for this first time, we're actually going to visit the browser. Notice I have not visited the browser once during this whole entire time. So let's switch over to the local version of the Coders Tape site, coderstape.test/new lessons. And there we go. So we have each of those as an image. All right, so obviously those images are too large. So let's give it a class of width of 100. There we go. And those are still a little too big. We'll play around with this a little bit. There we go. That's more like what I was thinking. So if we have a column of 2, let's add maybe a column of 8. and let's just say an H2. Let's try an H2 for now. And let's grab the lesson title. See what that looks like? All right, so we have each of the titles. Now each of these rows do need a little bit of padding. Let's do padding bottom of 3. There we go. That's a little bit better. And I would like this title to be down just a smidge, just a little high. So let me add a class to the H2 of padding top of 2. Yeah, I like that. And then underneath it, let's add a paragraph with maybe just a description. So lesson description. There we go. So we have description of the lesson, description of the lesson. And so we have 3 plus 8, that's 11. Let's just give it 9. That way we can complete that. So now this whole thing should be clickable. So let me actually wrap all of this in an anchor tag and paste that back in. And I have another nice little helper in my lesson model. Let me show you that one. That one is path. And there it is, URL path. So URL path gives me the path to this lesson. So all I have to do is just say lesson, give me URL path. Refresh. And now we do have to go back and change this color a little bit. But if you click on that, then yes, it takes you to that lesson. So now let's go ahead and mess with the color a little bit. So let's say on this H2, let's say text dark. And then on this one, let's add a class of text dark as well. Okay. So now we just need a title maybe for this page. And we'll say H1 of new lessons. And then let's add a p tag for a little bit of a description of what we have here. So here are the lessons that you have not completed yet. Happy coding. And there we go. Let's add a little bit of padding underneath this P. Let's do padding bottom of 5 maybe. That would be too much. Let's do 3. And there we go. So there it is. That's the basic of it. The only last little bit that I have is when I click on here, I do want to show this new lessons. So let's tackle that now. Let's go to my navigation. That's nav.blade. What I did was I extracted the navigation out as I typically do. And let's look up for that logout. That logout is right here. So let's add another anchor with a class of drop down dash item. And where are we going to be going? We're going to be going to /new lessons. And let's just call it new lessons. Let's check it out. Sure enough, now we have this new lessons right here, right on this drop down. So I'm going to do a little bit more work behind the scenes, getting this to look a little bit pretty. And by the time you watch this video, this is probably going to be live on the actual website. So go ahead and check it out, coderstape.com. And of course, you're going to have to register to see this in action, but that will complete today's lessons. I hope you enjoyed this style of lesson, as we're going to be adding more and more features to the Coders Tape website, and I will continue to bring you guys along so you can see what we're doing behind the scenes. So with that, don't forget to subscribe, and on the next lesson, we'll move on to something else.